Excellent. All right. I think we will probably get started, and the call will be recorded anyway. So, well, good morning again, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on our webinar this morning. We're very excited to have you here and to get stuck into our topic today. So, as I'm sure you're all aware, the title of today's webinar is all about cities adapting to climate hazards and risks and lessons learned. So, a very interesting topic, and I hope you will agree. And we will quickly just go through a bit of housekeeping, if that's okay, before we get stuck into the content. So the call is being recorded, and we will be sending this round at some point today after the session. We'll just upload it to YouTube first and send around the link if that's all right. So please bear that in mind. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please do put them in the Q&A, and we've set 15 minutes aside to go through these at the end. So we will get through as many as we can with the time we have. So that would be great. And in terms of housekeeping, I think that's probably it. So our speakers today, we have Nick Van Zwitten, who is joining us from ZRS, and we also have David Hounsell. So I will not get stuck into their introductions. I will let them do that themselves. But without any further ado, Nick, I will pass on over to you, if that's all right.
Thank you, Niall. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. You're joined by myself, Nick. So I'm one of the climate risk specialists in the UK climate team for ZRS, but I'm also joined by my colleague, David Hounsell, who helps on the liability side of things. So yeah, today what we'll be talking about is we're looking at everything climate. So what's likely to happen in the next 20, 30, 40 years in terms of climate change. So specifically, how will this impact the UK? We've got a few case studies from different global cities on exactly how they're responding to climate change. So we've got a case study from Boston and also in the Netherlands. We've also got a mini case study from Spain, but also looking at what's the context of the UK? So climate change hazards are impacting everyone globally, but how specifically are these impacting UK cities, but also UK clients? And also we'll finish on how can our team at ZRS support your clients? What can we do? And where do they begin when they're starting their climate resilience journey? So just to start off with, when we're looking at the UK state of climate, there's a few kind of takeaway messages. So you might have already realised over the last couple of years, we're experiencing more extreme events, and these are happening a lot more frequently. So in summary, we can see that the UK summers are becoming warmer and wetter, and our winters are becoming warmer and wetter, and our summers are becoming hotter and drier. So it kind of seems like it contradicts, but when we say our summers are getting drier, we are experiencing extremely heavy rainfall. So when it does rain, we're seeing very extreme events occur. And at the moment, many areas across the UK are being impacted by severe flooding in these kind of flash storm events. Even more recently, Stormbert over the weekend, we're seeing areas that have or haven't been impacted in the past by these severe weather events. I'll quickly hand over to David that will outline exactly how are these hazards impacting residents and people across the UK.
Thanks, Nick. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change and human health risk. There's both direct and indirect health consequences associated with the sort of range of climate change hazards that Nick's just described. And sort of the degree to which they're felt by different countries is very much a product of the sort of relative maturity and the capability of their environmental, social, and public health policies and strategies. So we've got direct consequences. So obviously the things like fatalities, physical injury, as well as ill health. We've seen with the recent flooding in Spain, the death toll is sort of just gone over 200 now. But one of the sort of scariest things was the uncertainty around that as the news started coming in, as they were finding more and more people have been trapped in their buildings and things like that. One of the interesting sort of knock-ons, the indirect bits for me, is around people's mental health. And UK's Health Security Agency have at the moment they've got a live request for evidence about the sort of associated mental health consequences. We know it's a big issue for the UK in general at the moment, and it's going to be sort of really interesting to find out what academics, as well as sort of the social care and health sector have noticed around how it affects mental health. We tend to find that support calls on most our insurance support lines are more often about mental health than anything else, regardless of what the actual person's claim was, whether it's flooding or heat related or even just physical injury, nothing to do with climate change. We tend to find that mental health is what people need the support with, as well as the actual claim responding. We also need to think about people's livelihoods and their access to healthcare. It's one of those things when you watch, the videos, particularly of Storm Bert over the weekend, as you watch that sort of water running down the streets. Tenbury Wells was one of the ones that sort of really caught people's attention. With watching that water going through people's, small businesses, this is their livelihoods. And whilst the insurance policy, they would expect those to sort of replace some of the damaged property, business continuity, and things like that. We're still getting into how it's affecting them, and the family relationships and all those sorts of things. So it's a lot bigger than just what it first appears. We tend to find that the burden doesn't fall equally on different people. There are certain groups of people who are more vulnerable, more disadvantaged, and particularly those with heat. And we're going to talk quite a lot about that. Or Nick is going to talk quite a lot about that, about underlying health conditions. So on the subject of heat, what are some of those direct impacts? Well, in the 2020 heat wave, it caused around an excess of 2,500 fatalities, and projections forward to 2050 are that it could cause 3 times that number. We find that mortality starts to increase around 24.5 degrees Celsius, which for a lot of people is, we kind of feels quite comfortable. We quite like that. It makes quite a nice change when you've had cold weather. We look forward to those things. So it's not really that high, but we're starting to see it affecting those vulnerable groups, in particular the elderly and the very young. Hot weather of 30 degrees plus for more than 5 days constitutes a heat wave, and health warnings are issued by the UK Health Security Agency at 28 degrees. And it's not just the air temperature. We've also got to think about what people are doing, so what the impact on their metabolic rate is, and also humidity and things like that, the ability for us to cool down. And a change in any one of those things can have quite significant consequences. The BBC did a little survey a little while ago where they subjected a test subject, a human, to an increase in temperature from 21 to 40 degrees Celsius over 1 hour. And during that time, a number of interesting things were measured. Their core temperature rose by 1.3 degrees. They lost nearly half a litre of sweat. Their breathing rate increased by 50% and their heart rate by 61%. Blood flow to their brain decreased by 8.5%. And their memory puzzle score, so they were set some tasks to do, their memory puzzle score fell from 23 out of 30 to 17 out of 30. And that's something that me personally I'm really interested in, is those sort of effects on people's behaviour and their ability to carry out work. My speciality is health and safety, so I'm sort of interested in those human factors bits. In France, the heatwave of August 2003, there's a very high number of deaths, particularly amongst the elderly, and a lot of that was put down to lack of thermal insulation in old properties, particularly for people who were living immediately below the roof, flat roofs. High overall temperature around the building was put down to one of the major factors in causing fatalities, but also people's lack of ability to adopt adaptive behaviours was also a significant thing. People just were not prepared to deal with the onset of the heat wave. And just in case you're thinking, oh no, it's not the doom and gloom insurance presentation, there might be some positives. British Medical Journal, also does point out a few some of the benefits that we might get from this. It might enable us to get outside more, with more social interactions, more opportunities for physical recreation, and that might have a knock-on effect on some of those health vulnerabilities that we see. So cardiovascular health, respiratory health, as well as sort of general exercise and mental well-being. So what might this mean for the insurance industry? Let's pull it back to our sort of day-to-day work. So climate vulnerabilities in insurance. Well, we've got a unique role as the Chief Risk Officers Forum notes on this slide. If we can go forward one, please, Nick. Thank you. Obviously, there's the fact that we provide risk protection for sort of the general role of insurance, but also the fact that the insurance industry controls and invests a huge amount of money. And so, as well as the physical protection that we provide through insurance policies, there's the risk management advice and adaptation work that we can help with, and that's the side of the business that Nick and I come from. We can, the insurance industry as a whole can help maintain insurability and sustain the economy. We can remain resilient and continue to support our customers, something around our actual capacity to be there for our customers over the long term. We can influence behaviours, and a lot of ESG reports from insurers will talk about how where we choose to place our investment income and the policies that we write as a way to try and influence the ESG and climate change agenda. We can support understanding of risk through research and disclosure, both on our own and with partners, and we can fortify society's resilience by continuing to invest in hazard models to develop and refine those so it provides greater and more real-time data. So there's lots of ways that we can look at the impact of different climate change risks on our customers, particularly those in urban areas, our subject today. So if we take flood events, for example, as Nick said at the beginning, that we're expecting flood events to be more frequent and more severe. Some of the impacts on property damage and business interruption are going to be fairly obvious. In fact, they're often used as a measure of how severe a storm has been. So the Spanish storms at the moment have been estimated at €4 billion insured losses. And that's just insured losses. But we also need to think about other lines of business, as the slide sort of indicates there. So if you imagine, for example, on employers' liability policies, if you've got employees who are either responding to or helping to clear up after floods, if you imagine how you've probably seen some of the videos of footage around Storm Bert and seeing people, both having to go into their premises afterwards. I saw a video of a chap in a motor garage afterwards, with all his tools and everything else, but he's got to go in there. So there's a safety aspect to it as well. The agency have just published the outcome of a court case where Openreach have been fined 1.3 million for the death of one of their engineers. He was working in a river, and colleagues have been there over the last couple of months trying to reconnect lines. There'd been flooding in the area, and the river was much higher and faster than it was usually. While he was attempting to cross a section of the river, Mr. Owen slipped in a deeper part and was swept away. Investigation found there was no safe system of work in place for work on or near water. They had not received any training information or instruction, and there was no safe working method. So perhaps, although this was a criminal investigation, it kind of sounds, for most of you who are familiar with liability cases, will realise what that would probably mean for this sort of for an EL policy. We'll think about the impact on public liability policies where customers, service users, or patients might be harmed by the effects of climate. I guess one of the most obvious ones probably to talk about would be patients in healthcare and social care settings who are affected by, particularly with heat waves. We think about how the availability of telephone support or online support for customers who experience mental health issues in the aftermath, either directly or indirectly in the aftermath of these things. There might be an impact on public liability or environmental impairment liability policies if flooding causes pollution to spread from either within the boundaries of our insureds, or for public liability outside of their boundaries and spreads to third parties' property. There might be implications on D&O cover where the board or senior leaders are failing to either respond to climate change risks and it has a material effect on the business's performance, or that they're failing to meet requirements for their ESG requirements and targets. And there's also potentially going to be the extent of legal fees coverage for criminal prosecutions, perhaps following a flood or even a heat wave. I imagine they would be pretty high in the event of an HSE investigation and a criminal prosecution, for example. We can make a similar projection for the impact of heat in our hotter world radiant, and air temperatures are going to rise. In response, our bodies try to lose heat. This is difficult unless we can reduce our metabolic rate through rest, wear clothing that helps with heat transfer, or increase the speed of air that helps take heat away from our bodies through ventilation and air conditioning. If none of these things happen, or they only are partially effective, then we have a problem. And it won't just be the physiological impact either. It affects our psychology and our behavior. A nationwide analysis in Japan about 10 years ago found ambulance transports due to assault increased linearly with the rise in daily temperatures. And a US study predicts an additional 22,000 murders and 3.5 million assaults because of climate change in the US by the end of the century compared to 2010. So I'm going to hand back to Nick, who's going to look at some of the interesting adaptations that individuals, industry, government, and some particular cities have made to address these risks, and how ZRS can help support customers to do this. Okay,
Thank you, David. Just to start off with, before I go over to what we're doing, how we're responding to climate adaptation, climate risks, we've got a short video to show you. So this is from the Met Office. And we are already experiencing these extreme events, but the Met Office have put together a video of a future climate weather forecast. So this is a weather forecast for a day in the UK of 2050. Okay, thank you everyone. For anyone that didn't catch the sound or the video, we will be sharing the link to that video after the call today. But just to summarize the main points of that. So that was a scenario that we're looking at 2050, but it's based on the heat waves that we faced in 2022. So we had record-breaking temperatures of 40 degrees in the UK, and the forecast outlines exactly what are the impacts to those climate hazards, how will it impact different residents across the UK. So I think so far we've been a bit doom and gloom about climate change, but there are some positives coming into the webinar. So we're looking at exactly how are we currently adapting to climate change. So a few cities globally have already started to implement some really great initiatives to reduce the risk of these climate hazards that will impact them. So I've got 2 case studies so far. So we start off with Rotterdam. So in Rotterdam, they have a very high flood risk, which might be quite well known. So as a city, they had very severe floods in the past century, which caused over 2,000 deaths. So as a city, they really had to respond to how we respond to our rising sea levels due to climate change. And one of their engineering solutions is this sea defence. So this is a movable sea defence. So when sea levels rise and there's a storm surge, this will go into place and protect the main harbour from those rising sea levels. But as a city, they've also realised they do need to live with higher levels of water. So when there are these heavy rainfall events, where does this water go? So instead of just saying water can't enter the city, it's what do we do with the water that comes into the city? And so they've got some really good initiatives so far that they've implemented to store this excess water. So the image on the right, as you can see, this is a multi-purpose facility. So this is in the centre of Rotterdam. And as you can see, this is actually a basketball court. So when there's not severe rainfall, this acts as sort of an amphitheatre and a basketball court. But then when there's severe rainstorm, you can see that this area fills up with water. This is one way that Rotterdam has responded to, okay, if we do experience heavy rainfall, where does the water go? So this is making sure that all the water that does fall in the city is directed into these storage water facilities. A couple of other solutions that they have is the duck park. So this is a 1 kilometre levee across the city, which has a green roof, and this is just an extra area that can store water. So during periods of extreme rainfall, this is another resource where the city can sort of hold on to water and it won't oversurge drainage systems and then back into the buildings and homes within the city. One other initiative are floating homes and apartments. So this is kind of more on the severe side of sea level rise and rising water. Is if water levels are increasing, we need to redesign our buildings. So in Rotterdam, there's a few buildings out there already, and also a floating park. So these are parks and homes that rise with the rising sea levels. So as you can see, Rotterdam have incorporated a multi-solution approach. So first of all, hard engineering, stopping water getting into the city. From heavy rainfall, where can we direct water? And also projecting further into the future, building homes and parks that can withstand rising sea level. My second case study is Boston. So Boston has a real issue with heat. So in the city, in the forecast earlier, it mentioned urban heat island effect. So Boston is already experiencing severe heat waves during summer conditions. And one thing that David mentioned in the earlier presentation was the kind of disproportionate impact of heat. So people across the city are impacted very differently to heat, and this can be due to health conditions. So if you have any underlying health conditions, the young, so anyone under the age of 5, anyone over the age of 65. So these are people that are more vulnerable to heat. But also within a city, it's disproportionate how much are impacted by heat. So this is two maps of Boston, and it shows on the left, these are the areas that experience the highest temperatures during a heat wave. And you can see these are all located within the city centre. And so one initiative that Boston undertook was mapping out the vulnerability to heat. So they experience high temperatures, but where exactly are those elevated temperatures likely to be? The image on the right was one of their solutions. So this was mapping out the heat relief network. So the purpose of this was, depending on where you live, how close to a cooling facility are you? So that can include parks, water features. This can be public spaces like museums or any sort of building with cooling facilities. So the purpose of this is during an extreme heat wave, people know where the resources are, they can go to cool off. Just to sort of illustrate the significant difference between these urban areas right in the city centre. So this image at the bottom shows the Douglas Historic District, and this is right in the city centre where you can see that red area. So this was temperatures of 40 degrees, and then in more of the urban areas, in more of the green areas, you're seeing temperatures of 34 degrees. So these are temperatures taken at the same point of the day, and you can see there's a 6 degrees temperature difference, and that's based on the environment. So the more concrete there is in a building, the more heat is absorbed, and then during the nighttime, that heat is released into the surrounding area, and there's very little capacity for these areas to cool down, and that's what leads to the kind of high risk to people. If there's no period of time in the day where there's a reduction in temperature, they become highly vulnerable to heat-related illnesses. So one way that Boston has responded to heat is they've adopted heat buddy phone check-ins, heat sensor networks, pop-up heat relief, which is the images you can see on the right, home energy retrofitting, and also developing a cool main street. So areas that members of the public use frequently in high temperatures, they've kind of highlighted these areas of we need to provide external shading and cooling facilities to reduce the temperatures in that area. So a case study that's a bit closer to home. So this was, we worked with a client in Madrid, and they wanted to understand what is the exposure to their city during heat events. So one kind of our approach to this is understand the hazard, understand the exposure, and understand what controls you have in place. So this was a sort of a pilot study for Madrid City, focusing on a key vulnerability. So we focused on young people in school. So to start off with, what's the hazard? What are the temperatures likely to be that they'll be impacted by? And then from that hazard, where are the biggest exposures? So where are areas with people with chronic illnesses, the areas of lower income districts, and also areas that have a lack of adapted outdoor space for heat. So from mapping out the hazard and the vulnerabilities, we could then target control measures to reduce the vulnerability to heat. So in these districts that have limited shading, this is where you'd go in and implement your adaptation. So improve the amount of shading outside, improve cooling facilities within school buildings. So the kind of purpose of this pilot study was to target one specific vulnerability in Madrid and make sure that adaptation measures were implemented in the correct place. Following on from that, we've got a short poll. So Sarah's will release a few questions. So we've spoken a lot about different case studies globally. We're going to try and bring that back to a UK context. So the first question is, what is the current annual cost of damage to non-residential properties from all sources of flooding? So this is only in the UK. So I'll give you a few moments to answer that question. Okay, we've got a few more responses coming in. Okay. So it looks like majority of you got the correct answer. So yes, that was 670 million, which is a huge cost of flooding in the UK. Going forward, in a 2 degrees warming scenario, the expected annual damage for non-residential properties will increase by 27%. And then by 2080, this will increase by 40%. So you can see that flooding is one of the huge major impacts to UK industries, and that is likely to increase going into the future. We've got a second question. So what letter did the Western European Storm Naming Group reach for the first time since the naming of storms was introduced in 2015 during the 2023 to 24 storm season? So this year, what letter of the alphabet did they get to for naming storms? So I'll give you a few moments to answer that question. Okay, looks like we have a couple of answers. So majority, again, we've got 60% spot on of Storm Leon. So I don't know if anyone remembers that storm. It was over the bank holiday weekend. So it was the one that impacted Reading Festival. So late into the summer season, we had this huge storm event that caused disruption all across the UK. And the last question. So if global warming continues on its current trajectory, resulting in worldwide temperatures rising to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels by 2050, what percentage of UK homes will be at risk of overheating? Okay, a couple of responses coming in. Thank you. Okay, so this is actually the one question where we have a higher percentage on the wrong answer. So it's actually 90%. So 90% of UK homes will be at risk of overheating by 2050. I think most people put the 50% answer, but no, it is actually the 90% answer. So one of the main issues we have with UK real estate is the age of our buildings. We have a very, very old housing stock, especially if you compare this to European homes. So one of the main challenges that we'll face in the UK is retrofitting these properties. So there's lots of things we can do in our homes and in our kind of business operational buildings to reduce the risk of overheating. And lots of people say we can just put in kind of air conditioning. There's also lots of designs you can do: external shading, internal shading, passive ventilation systems, increasing the amount of green space externally or on your roof to reduce that temperature. But that's one area that clients will have to kind of in the future plan into their kind of climate resilience journey. What adaptation measures will I implement to reduce the risk of overheating to my property? So that's the end of our poll questions. So just to close off, our presentation, exactly how can we help clients reduce the risk of climate hazards. So in the UK, we're a global network. So our UK global climate team are situated in the UK, Germany, Switzerland, Spain. There's also in Australia and the US. So what do we do? So just to start off with is, as we said in the Madrid project, you need to understand what your hazards are. So we do this by doing kind of global analysis reports. This can be at a global scale, or this can be at one site in particular. So we look at lots of different climate data. We look at regional data to understand exactly what are the different climate hazards that will impact that organization. So we do this from now up until 2100. And the outputs for these kind of analysis show sometimes, there's quite a few hazards that will impact your business, but also there might be certain climate hazards that won't actually become material for the next 20, 30 years. So it's quite a good way of understanding when do I need to respond to different climate hazards. We also work with clients on climate response plans. So the best thing you can do as an organization is prepare. So this feeds into kind of the climate data point. Do you know which hazards are likely to impact your site, and how well prepared are you for those sites? We found that working with clients, a lot of the kind of work that's been done to date is an emergency response. So once a hazard occurs, there's then an action plan that is put in place. But there's actually a lot you can do before a hazard event. So you can prepare for events, make sure you have the right defense mechanisms in place. So for a flood, do you have flood defenses? Do you know who needs to implement those before a weather event occurs? Are you signed up to weather warning systems? So there's a lot you can do as an organization to prepare before a climate event happens. And then lastly, we also have site-specific assessments. So we've spoken a lot about the hazard itself and the different vulnerabilities, but to sort of understand the complete risk of climate hazards to a location, you need to understand exactly what controls are there. So as an organization, you might actually already have quite a few control measures that reduce the risk of climate hazards. But kind of our purpose, if we go on site or do a desktop analysis, we identify where are those gaps, what kind of quick wins can you put in place as an organization to reduce the risk of climate change. I'll hand back over to David, who will talk a little bit about the liability solutions.
Thanks, Nick. One of the great things about Zurich is the breadth of knowledge across the risk engineering function, across Zurich Resilient Solutions. Most climate change risks don't exist in isolation. If there's a property risk, there's likely to be a people risk as well. So from a liability perspective, whether that's EL or PL, or even products, something we haven't really touched on today, but the products liability associated and product safety associated with climate change is going to be an interesting thing for us to perhaps explore. But we can, just as Nick said, we can support you and your customers in identifying at-risk workers and third parties that are part of the business, assessing their exposures to climate change risks and their adaptation strategies, their risk management, their risk control processes. And just as a little example, I carried out a review of a customer's headquarters building a few years ago with one of our colleagues in the property team. And they looked at sort of traditional flood protection and their business interruption and their resilience programs. And then I combined that with a review of the health and safety implications of their flood emergency response plan. And it's one of my shortest ever surveys because they had nothing in place. They had no policy for the safety aspects of what it was they were going to be doing, no risk assessments, and no training for their first responders. But at least we knew where they were. We had a baseline with which we could then start to support them. So that's it. Just a couple of little examples from me. I think if we go to the next, I think it's our final slide. Just to sort of summarize, so I'm David, joined obviously with Nick today. Thank you for your attention, and we can now hand it over to you guys for any questions that have come in or anything you think of now.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Nick, very much for that. That was That was really interesting. I think we've got a couple of questions that have come through on the Q&A. So again, guys, if there is anything that you want to ask, please do shoot that over, and we will get through those. So our first question from Tom is, what would you say our clients with limited budgets should do to prevent disruption or health concerns for employees or customers?
That's a really great question. So yeah, climate resilience doesn't have to be costly. There's lots you can do in-house as part of your operation system to reduce the risk of those climate hazards. So as I mentioned previously, you could focus on your response planning. And as part of that, identify within your organization exactly who's vulnerable to those climate hazards. So if you're in a manufacturing site and you have people with chronic illnesses, or are particularly older, it's identifying who those people in the organization are during a heat event, knowing these are people you need to focus on and make sure they're not exposed to those high temperatures.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Nick. We have another question here from Sarah, which is for clients starting to think about climate risks. Where do you recommend they begin?
That's a really great question. Thank you. So one thing we recommend is understand the hazard first. So as David said, you might not be at risk of every single climate hazards. In the UK, it's a lot of the risks that we focus on are from flooding, wind, and more increasingly heat. But yeah, step one, make sure you know exactly what hazards are likely to impact your building.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if there are any more questions that anyone has that you'd like to put to either Nick or David. I think something's come through here from Rob. How does the UK compare with other countries in terms of preparedness for climate change? Are we behind?
In terms of this question, it's interesting. It depends on the hazard. So from my experience, when we talk about flooding, it's the one hazard that actually in the UK, there's a lot more that we can do, but it's the one hazard that people are aware of and they're actively trying to reduce the risk. A lot of mechanism so far is using flood resistant measures, so blocking water coming in. But I think there's a lot we can do in the UK to become more flood resilient. So as a case study earlier with Rotterdam, is living with the changing risk of flooding. So if a site does flood, the turnaround time is much, much quicker. So the building is resilient to flooding. I think one area that we're kind of lacking is heat. So in other countries across the globe, because they're experiencing those hot temperatures already, they have cooling facilities. Their buildings are designed to withstand higher temperatures, whereas in the UK, we're just not ready for extreme heat. We've got a very old housing stock. We don't have many cooling facilities. We sort of will panic when the temperatures go above 30 degrees. So I think globally, heat is probably our biggest issue for preparedness.
Fantastic. Thank you again, Nick. And I'm not too sure if there are any other questions so far, so I'll give it another minute just in case anything burning comes up. Maybe something coming through from Simon there, but I'm not too sure. We'll give it another moment. And if not, I think we can likely finish a bit early. So we have, is the UK, I think Simon's question is maybe slightly breaking up. So sorry, Simon.
I think the question is, are we adequately reviewing
There we go. Project construction wise in advance. There we go.
Okay, yes. So to answer this question, yes, I think we are moving towards sort of understanding what our properties are made of. There's a lot of policy recommendations that have been put forward. So particularly in London, in response to heat, there's been a real push towards we need to promote retrofitting, we need to promote a maximum working temperature. These are all guidelines and kind of recommendations, but at the moment there's no policy in place to say, okay, this is our response to climate change, this is what we should do. So there's a lot of research out there of what we can do in construction, but there needs to be a bit more of a global push towards that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nick. Any more this morning? If not, then perhaps it might be time to call it a day. If everyone is happy with that, Nick and David.
Yeah, if you do have any questions for us or would like to know more information, you can go and scan this QR code and it takes you straight to our website. There's lots of resources on what we've spoken about today.
Brilliant. Yes, and just to follow that up, we will be sending round a follow-up email as well later on today. So you'll be able to access the recording, and should you have any questions, please get in touch. But thank you both Nick and David again for walking us through this morning, and thank you all so much for joining. Hope you found that useful and certainly interesting, and yeah, I hope you enjoy the rest of your Fridays and enjoy the weekend when it arrives. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.